All right, we're back. All right, welcome to Rick Rabbi Rashi VaYikra. We're starting a new book. Without further ado, Rick, you read the Parsha VaYikra. What interested you?
So obviously, this parsha deals with the korbanim. It's the sacrifices. There's many types of offerings that we give depending on what we're doing. But I found that one of the things that didn't interest me, it was actually kind of troubling for me as a 21st century person, was the fact that we take these innocent animals and what we do is we sacrifice them in order to get closer to God. And it seems to be like, to me, it's a cognitive disconnect that you have to kill something in order to make yourself closer. So explain to me, Rabbi, why you think that's true and why we do it.
It's a great question. I think it's a question probably everybody has. In general, like, why is the sacrifices, or in Hebrew, it sounds better in Hebrew, karbanot, the offerings, the close makers, but why are we sacrificing animals? Like, what's the purpose of this? So I think there's two questions here. Like, one is, what did the animal do? That's right. One. Two is, like, even if we could put that aside, like, why does God find this so meaningful? God calls this a reach nichoach, a pleasing scent, a scent of appeasement, of pleasure to God. Like, particularly by karbanos, by the sacrifices. God doesn't mention that by other mitzvahs. It says the karbanos particularly are called, like, they really make God happy. Twizzlers make mouths happy. The karbanos really make God happy for whatever reason. So the question is why? So you have two questions, I think, here. So I think let's talk about the meaning of karbanos in general. Then we'll talk about the animal use of it. So first of all, I want to just describe what happened at the altar, like what was there. So first of all, you'll notice that there was a representation of every one of the four strata of kingdoms in our world. You had salt on the altar. Every karban had to have salt, which is why we have, by our bread, by our challah, we have salt. It's to remember the altar, because we don't have an altar, so we remember it by our table. Number two, there was either wine, libations, or flour, or oil. There was some sort of vegetative representation there, always. Vegetative produce. There was an animal, whether a cow, whether a sheep, whether a kosher dove, turtle dove. And there was always a kohen. There was a kohen on behalf of a Jewish owner or all the people doing the rites, a human being representing the human kingdom. So you have human kingdom, animal kingdom, vegetative kingdom, and mineral kingdom, which makes you realize there's got to be a lot of symbolism here. There's a lot of symbolism going on here. It's not random. You have a perfect representation of all parts of creation, right? Okay. But why are you bringing all those ingredients there? So to understand this, I have to mention a line I heard that Rabbi Steinsaltz said to the board of rabbis circa 1970s, 80s. He was invited to be the keynote speaker at the New York Board of Rabbis. Big, it was packed house, people outside the door, really, everybody wanted to hear this, this very famous scholar. He gets up on the stage and he says to all the New York Board of Rabbis, circa 1970s, early 80s, and he says to them, Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. I repeat, Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. Therefore, if you're not learning it and teaching it to your constituents, you're not doing your job. End quote. And then he spent an hour defending, proving why this is so.
Right.
Because as you can imagine, many people, particularly then, it got more in vogue later, but mysticism wasn't the popular pulpit topic, or wasn't something that you found in synagogues or temples as Today, even more you do actually in a way, but back then it was, you do Jewish, you have tradition, you do whatever it was, right? But it's very important to us that Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people, meaning we cannot understand this book called the Torah without the mystical traditions that are codified in the Zohar, because particularly when you get to a mitzvah, some you could understand to some degree, like don't steal, don't murder, be kind, love your fellow. You don't need Kabbalah. Kabbalah definitely enlightens our eyes even more so, but they have meaning even just by simple, moral reading. When you get to sacrifices, you don't understand, you don't think mysticism, you don't have a mystical backdrop. It makes no sense. So we have to realize we have to have a backdrop, a little bit of Kabbalah in order to appreciate the relevance. Because in that backdrop where it has we can wrap our heads around why an infinite God would find a barbecue so meaningful. So in very, very short, this will be our main, topic of today, there's a Kabbalistic insight into creation, which is how does God create the world? So it's not like many people think that God, even if they believe in God, that God created it and now it's on sort of nature runs it. It's an autopilot. God, created Big Bang, created from, and now it's kind of like, there's a system in place, right? Kabbalah says that's not true. That while God did create initially, but because the initial state of existence was only God, and there was nothing else. God is the original existence. That's the term Maimonides calls. God is original existence or absolute existence. Everything else is later existence, extended existence, extension of that. So because everything else in this idea wasn't a given that stuff exists. On the contrary, it was a given they don't exist. The one infinite God exists. Everything else doesn't exist. God desired for it to be a world, so he existified things, for lack of a better word. But because it's not its natural state to exist, because natural is really the way it should be, only God exists, you're going, by the mere fact that a world and people and stuff exists, you're going against its natural grain, right? If I throw a baseball into the air, I can throw it really high for about 10 seconds, but the second my force leaves it, the novelty, the flying in the air will stop and it'll revert to its natural state, which is gravity. So a novel existence needs constant perpetuation. That's the basic idea of Kabbalah.
And that's the Kabbalah.
That's Kabbalah. The Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov and the Tanya explain even more, but it's a Kabbalistic idea. And therefore, everything you're seeing now, while it feels stationary, it's being vivified into existence. And with modern science, the past, we know atomic energy, this even makes more sense. That mass is really energy, right? We thought until now stuff was a block of, what was a block of? No, it's not a block, but it's actually spinning molecules. So Kabbalah says that those spinning molecules they're also somewhat physical, and there's a metaphysical force that is enlivening them constantly.
That's a new take on Kabbalah that I've never heard. That I think it's interesting that it's sort of, I like the metaphor.
Everything is always it's no such thing as just is. A rock is being created, and the way it's being created, but the Torah gives an analogy of the letters. The letters, God said, or the letters are like, as a metaphor, a word is a bridge between what's in my brain to you, to the other, to the outside. So the words are the way I.
So how does the Kabbalah? How does it inform the sacrifice? In other words, how does it keep? So that's the essence of our discussion, right?
Everything that exists, minerals, vegetative, animals, human beings, are not stationary. God is constantly giving them spiritual flow that their physical existence can exist. Okay. Now, why don't we see that? If you're just basically a hologram, right? How come we don't see the source? How don't we see that we come from the source? Like, I'm basically saying that you're a hologram. Everything you're seeing is a spiritual hologram. But the difference of a hologram, it comes from the projector. Here, you don't see that you come from the jug. You actually come to, you see you come from autonomous beginnings, right? We see a rock just comes from the ground comes from the ground, whatever, we don't see it coming from God. We see it coming from just it is once it's here.
So a rock is not inanimate, is what you're saying. It actually
Exactly.
has
There's no such thing as inanimate. Everything is really, it's inanimate relative to other things. The answer of why we don't see how it's not inanimate is because God, in wanting to have a world with partnership with us making it, had to make a veil of his presence so we can have free choice and choose this partnership. Otherwise, there's no partnership. It's puppetry. So
I like that, by the way. That imagery is fantastic. I like that.
So that's very, very short. I'm giving you that's
okay.
Creation 101 according to Kabbalah. Now, having said that, there's a problem we have. Many times we think we're autonomous beings. That's the industry hazard, right? We forget our natural state. We don't feel that there's God always in it. We feel we make our life. We are responsible. We're survival. We need our survival. So that's the challenge. How do we overcome this need to be autonomous, but to recognize that ultimately we're not autonomous? So that we have to take reflection, prayer. That's the reconnection. That was what as a matter of fact, prayer is just a post-temple era replica of the sacrifices. The sacrifices were to give you that clarity. That stuff actually comes from God. Although, yes, outside the perfect laboratory of the temple, it's a big bad world of autonomous stuff, and you got to be strong. But in the temple, where things was more spiritually aligned, you could see how stuff actually, you would go there to see how, outside it's scary, but in the walls of the temple, you're going to see how reality is really coming from God. And this is how it happened. It says in the altar, there was a small fire. The Kohanim had to light a fire on the pyre. But it says what happened was they lit a small fire and God would shoot, it's in Rashi, God would shoot a fire from heaven to consume the offering. What was this? God's like, Thor, God's like throwing fireballs. What's going on here? So I heard a beautiful idea. Everything I told you about how God creates from pristine oneness and then like makes a flow and hides his flow to make an autonomous creation. When you brought the offering on the altar, that fire from above it, the Talmud says the fire came. You know what it was? It was a fire that unraveled the facade of autonomy. It took that animal and it undid the animal, the salt and the vegetative stuff, and undid it back into divinity. You saw it was like that was his miracle. It was you saw a creation in reverse, basically, and it was very inspiring.
That's a very interesting concept about the sacrifice. Instead of it being sort of gory and bloody, it's actually a return. to that universal state where we are
ultimate existence, real part of God.
Right. That's
when I read that, it blew me away. It was an article in Chabad. Someone researched it, and it's a beautiful, beautiful way. And that gets, now that we have that sort of, by the way, that's one of the great things that Steinsaltz did. He always gave context. You can't read with your, we have a particular 21st century Western way of looking at things, for better or for worse. Right. We're gonna look at stuff like, I don't get it. Okay, you don't know every context of every, we don't know every context of every culture, and that's what the greats can do. The Steinsaltz, the Rebbe, they can give you, context, and then you can. Context.
It's interesting that it's, instead of being something that's bad, viewing it as something that's bad, right, for the animal, in some ways, it's actually good. So this is
exactly, yes.
It's not bad. It's good. You've changed my mind tonight. That's interesting.
So let me tell you a good thing. I heard a great. There's one of the first Hasidic Kabbalistic books in English. Now there's everything in English, but in the early 70s, there's barely anything. There was a Chabad rabbi, Australian rabbi called Modis Cantor. He wrote a book. I forgot the name of the book, but he had a poem there. And it's a beautiful poem called "Two Cows They Were." And basically talks about two cows they were at the abattoir, whatever it was, and one was sold to a non kosher slaughterhouse. One was done to a Jewish kosher butcher, kosher slaughterhouse, and it describes how the cow that was to the non-Jewish one was slaughtered and used to whatever, and then it became ski boots or something, like it. And versus the one in the Jewish one, what happened? It was slaughtered with intention. It was utilized. It was packaged to meat. It was taking all the blood out with more intention. It was sold in the butcher to a Jewish family who had a Shabbos meal with it, and thereby elevating, utilizing it more for more purposeful spiritual use. It's a much more poetic poem, but it's exactly this point. Like, it wasn't the way we look at using animals in a reasonable way as possible is that we're not just being greedy. We're just eating animals. We believe that our job as human beings is to elevate everything, and God gives the tools to do that. We do it in particular ways.
So you've changed my opinion that it's not barbaric, but it's actually a good thing. I like the way you put that together tonight. That's good.
Thank you. It's something that I can't say. It's one of the things I remember all the time. This because it's such a big question, and when I found the answer, it really stuck. It really. Again, you have to have the context, and then you can appreciate it. So we have time for maybe one more.
Well, no, we need to do two more.
Okay, two more.
Okay, because you need to solve the problem on the unleavened, on the loaves, right? So the egalitarian piece of Judaism, not everybody can come with the same offering, and there's a grain offering that can be made, and it's made in such a way that there's 10 loaves. So I'm wondering why they picked the number 10. And then, of course, there's the unleavened bread. And so...
first of all, the breads, for the most part, were all unleavened on the altar. For the most part. I think there's an exception, Shavuos, because there's something... Simply matzah represents lack of ego. It's flat, it's humble, it's the ingredients of bread and water, flour and water, but it's minus the rising, which represents ego. So in some way, matzah is sort of the bread of faith, because you have to lack of ego to have faith. You can imagine the altar is going to have similar unleavened stuff as well. That's such a general. I didn't look too much into it, but I would imagine that's kind of why 10. I don't know. I'm sure there's a better answer, but 10 in general is a whole number for many things.
Okay, and there's just one more. I mean, I have plenty more for tonight, but we'll only go for one more, and maybe I will join your 9 o'clock in the morning.
We can't do this in just 25 minutes a week,
I know you're just becoming restless about this. So, can you explain more in depth the concept of the unintentional misdeed and the intentional misdeed, and how that plays into the offerings and the sacrifices and how we approach it?
So you didn't bring an offering for just anything. There's particular reasons why you bring an offering. You bring it as a voluntary thank you to God. You bring it as there's public sacrifices on behalf of the people, also, devoted sort of Thanksgiving type ones. Then there was something called the sin offering. A sin offering was if you did a certain category of sin, but it was unintentional, you had to bring this carbon, the sacrifice, to atone for it. If you did it intentionally, that very same thing, you would have another punishment, which is more severe, but it was a spiritual punishment called kares. Kares means excision, where basically you did something a little bit where you cut the cord to God, and therefore back then when they lived in a more spiritual way, they literally would die at 50 years old or whatever. They would die early. But if you did unintentionally, you don't deserve that. So you just have to make some atonement. You bring a sin offering. That was the reason what the sin offering was for. So in very, very short, this is a discussion about are we guilty when we do something wrong unintentionally? So of course, if you hurt somebody unintentionally, it doesn't help that much because you hurt somebody. But even to God, if you did something that was, let's say, profaning to God, but it was unintentional, God knows you didn't mean it. Why would you? God understands. So it's not about God, it's about us. That's the problem. It's not about the unintentional slip. It's not about God. It's about us. Because the fact that you could do something, even mechanically, without thinking, and do something that you should know better is profaning to God, that shows that your subconscious is a little bit out of whack. You got to go to therapy or something. Meaning, it's not like, oh, it's unintentional. No. That shows that this is deeper than conscious. And it's funny in a way, not obviously like black and white, but in a way, an unintentional mistake could have far-reaching, worse effect than an intentional mistake. An intentional mistake you do usually out of rebellion. Well, when you stop rebelling, you know what you did, and you would make atonements for it. But when you're unintentional, you never really, did I really mean it? Did I really do it? You're kind of like, you don't want to make amends as much. So it's kind of funny. When unintentional, something's going to be a sticky situation, a stickier thing. And also, again, the main thing is it shows on unintentional. It means that subconsciously, without even thinking, you go do a sin.
Right.
That's something you gotta atone for.
Right. Yeah, I think of that as a subconscious misdeed as opposed to the very conscious misdeed. I mean, there are people who just do things because they, I read in Positivity Bias about a Jew who purposely goes out and eats non-kosher food to punish the rabbi and punish his community. It's very intentional, right? But you understand the differences between the
one day when he realizes, whenever the trauma he's going through, he doesn't want to rebel, he'll know he did it, and he'll make atonements. But if he was sort of like not, he didn't mean, like he didn't know, like it's much harder, and it's a longer conversation, But I think the main thing we learn is, to sum up, I think from this is the opening word of this book, of this parsha, book and parsha VaYikra is Adam ki yakrav mikem karban lashem. The second verse. A man, when he wants to bring from you people, a sacrifice to God. And the commentators ask, it's kind of like a weird structure of the sentence. A person, when he wants to bring, oh, by the way, this person's from among you, and comma, a sacrifice to God. Why don't you say, when a person from among you wants to bring a karban, he does so and so. Why? Like when a person wants to bring a karban from you, it's like the from you should be in the beginning. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I got it.
So the answer is because the whole idea of the karban then, and even now, we do the spiritual version is it has to come from you. It's not the animal. You're bringing you. You can't bring a karban, a sacrifice from an animal. That's a mechanism. That's a inspiration. That's a tool. But ultimately, you got to bring the sacrifice from you. It's got to come from you. That's why it says when a person wants to bring a sacrifice, it's got to come from you. It can't come from, mainly it's from you. The details, the animal, the mechanism, that's a separate thing. So as we see, a lot of old-fashioned stuff is really very, very deeply relevant to today. But we got to learn it. You got to learn it and learn it. So, yasher koach.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi, and Shavua Tov to you and to our audience. And we'll
Tov.
talk next week before Shabbat.
All the best. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.